What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Midweek Multiplied. What took us, mostly me, 14 videos to do last semester, and that was cover the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It only took Dylan 30 minutes to do in the recap video that we put out last week. And so if this is your first time, I want you, your first time watching these videos, you're in a small group or something, I want you to go check out that recap video because Dylan does an incredible job of showing where we've been, but also looking forward to where the Bible is going and where we're going even this semester. I did get the cameo in the video, which was pretty sweet, but Dylan just crushed it, and so I hope to be like him one day when I grow up. But yeah, welcome to Midweek Multiplied. And for us, we did study the first 5 books of the Old Testament last semester, and it is something that Dylan and I both are really passionate about, the Old Testament and the relevance it has for your life. And so just to recap, just to recap where we were last semester, Genesis, we studied that God created, and in that creation God created man, and man was good, and we had these perfect relationships with God, with other people, and also the rest of creation around us. But sin fractured those 3 relationships, and we were in this downward spiral, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. But then God doesn't let sin have the final word, and he makes a promise to this seemingly insignificant nobody named Abram, and he says, Abram, in Genesis chapter 12, through you all nations will be blessed. I'm going to build a family through you that's going to bless the rest of the world, essentially. And so we see God come through on that promise, and he gives him a son called Isaac, and Isaac has a son called Jacob, and Jacob's renamed to Israel, and Israel has 12 sons that are the 12 tribes of Israel later, but he has 12 sons, and they make their way down through a crazy set of circumstances that God is guiding to Egypt. And in Egypt, that's where the first book ends, Genesis ends, and in Exodus, these Israelites multiply from a family into a nation. That nation is unfortunately enslaved and oppressed, but God doesn't forget them. He remembers them, and he brings them out of Egypt and passes them. He parts the waters of the Red Sea and leads them out through the desert to this mountain, and on this mountain called Sinai, he makes a covenant and kind of doubles down and says, yes, I'm going to bless all nations through you. You are my nation. You're going to be my nation of priests. And God makes a covenant with this nation. And after he makes a covenant with this nation in Exodus, we saw in Leviticus a little more detail about what that entails. How can a holy, good God relate to these sinful people? And Leviticus kind of shows us this interesting thing that God does. He makes a way for that to happen through something called the tabernacle, which is just a portable temple, essentially. And he also, in Leviticus, it's all about God's presence and how we, as sinful people, come into God's presence. So it seems like all these rules and regulations are starting to make more sense in that light. And so after the book of Leviticus, we get the book of Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, we see this whole nation leaving Mount Sinai and wandering through the desert. And we saw the theme there essentially was in all of the rebellion. Even after we made this covenant, human beings continued to rebel against God, and God was still faithful to us. And it all culminates with, essentially, there's so much rebellion that an entire generation is punished to wander in the desert for 40 years until their children, it won't be them, but it will be their children, enter into something called the Promised Land. It's this land that God has promised to Abram. So the final book of the 5 that we studied is Deuteronomy. So they've passed through the desert finally after 40 years, and on the edge of the desert, and the only thing separating them between the desert and the Promised Land is this Jordan River. So they're on the edge of the Jordan River, and Moses, the leader throughout this whole thing, essentially delivers his final speech. And in this, he says, essentially, before you is blessings and curses. So if you obey, you'll experience blessing. If you disobey, you'll experience curse. And it's this crazy final speech. And he says, remember who you are. You are God's chosen people. And so we're poised on the edge here, and it's this major cliffhanger, like what is going to happen? So tonight we're studying the 6th book of the Bible called Joshua. And so now, here we are. The nation of the Israelites, God's chosen people, are about to enter the promised land. So I just covered a lot of material. As we jump into this, I want you to be thinking about one thing. And I want you to reflect on this for a second. What is an absolute win for your life? And so, what the heck am I getting at? So, let's say you graduate college. You get the degree you want. Your 20s look, the rest of your 20s look like you want them to, and it just kind of extends all the way to the end of your life. If your wildest wishes were granted, what would that look like to you? And I want you to think about that. And I want to make a very bold statement here at the end of this little intro. I think this book, if we look at it, I want to jump in and I want to study some of the details here. I think that if you take this seriously, the perspective that this book is putting forward, the 6th book of the Old Testament, I know that's weird, I think it could change your life. It could change the course of your life. It could change what you consider a win, what you consider to be a great life. So as we study the book of Joshua, really, I'd like to break it down into 4 chunks. And the first chunk is chapters 1 through 5. And this first section is really dealing with this major cliffhanger, essentially. And the cliffhanger is Moses is dead. So who's going to lead this entire nation of people? And so the first chapter and the first little bit of the book essentially deals with that by presenting this man named Joshua as the new Moses. He's going to be the new leader of this nation and of these people. And so one of the ways that it does this is God communicated with Moses, spoke with Moses, and he does that. God speaks with Joshua here. So the things that Moses was doing, Joshua is now doing. And one of the most iconic verses from Joshua is in chapter 1, and it's verse 9, and it says this. This is God talking to Joshua. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So God is with Joshua. So that is a huge deal. And the text presents Joshua as the new Moses in that way, and then a variety of other ways. It mentions that he is essentially a man that is faithful to the law, to the Torah, essentially. And it also, Joshua, just like Moses did, sends out spies. So Moses sent spies to view the land. Now Joshua is sending spies. And we don't have time to go into this, but when Joshua sends spies into Canaan, the promised land, we get the story of Rahab. And it's a beautiful story for a variety of different reasons, but something that I want you to think about and consider. Read it for yourself. But Rahab is a prostitute, and she ends up in the genealogy of Jesus. Think about that. So moving on, the Israelites finally enter the promised land. And how did they do it? Well, Joshua parts the waters. Really, it's God, but through Joshua, the waters of the Jordan River are parted just like the waters of the Red Sea were parted for Moses. So again, Joshua is presented as this new Moses, and it's a reflection back on the Exodus. God is still with these people, still working wonders. And we'll revisit this in a bit, but God brings these people through the waters and they commemorate it. This is a book of basically conquering, but then also remembering whose they are and who they are. And so we're going to revisit this passing through the waters and this commemoration service, because when they pass through the waters, they set up stones to remember this, what God has done for them. So this section ends with Joshua seeing a man with a drawn sword. And this is in chapter 5. And he goes up to this man, and turns out it's not a man at all. It's an angel, and it's the commander of the Lord's army. So this is a really interesting section when Joshua says, essentially, are you for us or are you against us? And the commander of the Lord's army, this angel, says neither. It's a super interesting reply. And this is so significant because it shows that this is not, and there's going to be some battles later on, a little bit of spoiler alert. These battles are not necessarily the Israelites versus the Canaanites, but this is God's battle. So this next section is chapter 6 through 12, and it's really a conquest section. And so that's when the Israelites go in and they start to take these cities in Canaan. And so we need to address right off the bat why these Canaanites, why are they taking over these people's cities, and where did these people come from? So we can trace the Canaanites' lineage all the way back to Noah. So Noah had a son named Ham, and Ham had a son named Canaan. And if you want to read this, go back to Genesis chapter 9, and that will tell you the story of why Canaan was cursed because of his father's sin against Noah. And so we trace the lineage of these people all the way from Noah to Ham to Canaan, all the way to the Canaanites that are now the people inhabiting this land. And I'll say more about them in a second. But as they enter, there's the story of these two cities, essentially. So the first two cities that the people of Israel capture and take over. The first is Jericho, and you may have heard this growing up in the South, some Bible story about it. But this was when they enter and they march around the city silently for 6 days, and then the Levites basically sound horns, make noise on the seventh day, and the city collapses. And so it's easy to sort of relegate this to a children's story, but I think the point is extremely powerful and clear that is speaking to us. This is God's victory. So the people played their part, but it is God that ultimately brings about the victory, not the people. So after they take the city of Jericho, there's this interesting story of this Israelite named Achan. And so Achan takes some of the possessions that they got from Jericho, and these were possessions that were supposed to be devoted to the Lord. So these things were completely devoted to the Lord. All the things that they got from the city, it's almost like this first fruit, this first city's offering was going to be offerings to God. But he takes them for himself and he lies about it. And the point of this story, without going into all the detail, and I've said this all year long, me recounting this is okay, but man, if you really get into the details reading it yourself, it has so much beauty and so much more richness. But back to Achan. So Achan, essentially, he takes these things, and the point that the story is making is his disobedience does not go unpunished because the Israelites get special treatment. So the people in the land are wicked, the Canaanites are wicked, but if the Israelites also do wicked things, then they don't get special treatment. They are also punished. And it's this intense and extremely sad story of punishment because of the sin of Achan. And so I think that's a very, very important point to mention as we kind of unpack these chapters at 6 through 12 that are extremely intense and extremely problematic for a lot of people. So again, we have to ask, why the Canaanites? Why these people? And so I think part of our answer here is found in Leviticus chapter 18. So in Leviticus chapter 18, it talks about a variety of things, but primarily it's talking about the Canaanites being extremely immoral. extremely wicked people, and this plays out with sexual immorality, but also they had even sacrificed their children to other gods, to false gods. And the end of that chapter, it talks about essentially God won't stand for that they cannot inhabit the land if they are to behave this way, and that they will quite literally be spewed out. But be careful, Israelites, because if you behave this same way, then you also will be spewed out of the land. So you see that in Leviticus 18, but also in Deuteronomy chapter 12. So both of those books mention the wickedness of the Canaanites. So I think if we look at it, God doesn't want these wicked practices of the Canaanites to influence the Israelites. And so if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 20, we see kind of the point or the goal of the Israelites relating to other countries. So in this Deuteronomy chapter 20, they're to pursue peace with other cities, with other people, to offer peace to these other nations. But there's this very specific time when God was bringing justice on human evil. And it's seen in these destruction of the Canaanite cities. And so for us, that's never meant for us to use God as a way to incite violence or incite violence in the name of God. I don't think that you can reconcile that with the rest of the Bible. And I think it's extremely important for us to take the rest of the Bible's testimony into consideration here when we're discussing this topic. Also, I think if you look at the violence that's recorded in Joshua, we also have to look at what Joshua itself says in chapter 10, that they destroyed everyone. They killed everyone in the city. But then later in chapter 15, it says in these very same cities, Debir and Hebron, that they drove people out of those cities. So you can't drive people out if everyone was completely dead. So I think this was some hyperbole here. The point that we need to take from this is the seriousness that God places on His people and the cultures, what they do representing Him. So if you have the nation of Israel, the Israelites representing God, the seriousness that He places on their holiness and what they do. And there's obviously a significant effort here to not let the Canaanites' evil and detestable practices work their way into the culture of the Israelites. So again, I don't think Joshua or any other biblical text allows for ethnic cleansing, for genocide as a practice, but this was a particular moment in the initial settlement of the Israelites where God works, and I think that we need to weigh this against the rest of Scripture. So then we move into the third section, which is chapters 13 through 22. And in chapters 13 through 22, the beauty of this is really lost on us because it seems extremely tedious, where they have conquered all this land now. They conquered and they're dividing up this land amongst all of the Israelites, the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's extremely detailed and probably monotonous to us. But here is the amazing thing. This is a revelation about God and His character. I ask every time, what does this say about God? Well, if we look back, this says that God fulfills His promises, because God promised all the way back in chapter 15 of Genesis that He was going to give this land to Abraham, and He makes good on His promises. And so I think that has major implications for other things that God promises. And so I want to revisit that in a bit, but this is a major thing that's communicated in the biblical text. God said He was going to do something, and He does it. The last section of the book here in chapters 23 and 24 really mirror Deuteronomy and Moses' final speech. So here Joshua essentially presents the same information that Moses gave on the other side of the Jordan. He says, Are you going to be faithful to the covenant? Joshua says, are you going to be faithful to the covenant? Because if you do, you'll experience life and blessing. But if you don't, you'll experience curse, and you're going to be kicked out. You're going to be spewed out, as the Bible says, of the land. So I think that this whole book, and really this lesson that I want to present to you tonight, really hinges on chapter 24, verses 15. And there's a lot to it, but this question is put forth to them. Joshua puts to them this question: who are you going to serve? You need to decide, who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve God? So wrapping up, here's something amazing. Joshua in Hebrew translates to Yeshua, and Yeshua in Greek translates to Jesus. And so there's this simple yet amazing point being made here that Jesus or Joshua is a symbol. It's an archetype. So just as Joshua led his people from the desert to the promised land, Jesus is leading people from a desert to the promised land. And this time Joshua, this Joshua is not leading people to capture cities and defeat evil people, but Jesus is defeating the forces of evil himself. And so it's this amazing connection simply with the name of Joshua and Jesus. And there's some points that I want you guys to talk about, and I want you to think about this because it could change you forever. It could change the course of your life. So I asked, who are you going to serve? In Joshua 24. The question he puts to them is who are you going to serve? And so I think the question is, who are you going to follow? Because Joshua was a leader. And simply put, Jesus is a leader in so many ways. And he's asking you, are you going to follow him? And so are you going to follow? Because I can guarantee you you're following something or someone. And I hope that you've seen so far in all the narratives, if you were with us last semester and here, that this story is not a human story. This story is not about humans. It's about God. And I hope that if you've learned nothing else about humans through these stories, I hope that you've learned about the condition of the human heart. And it's completely selfish. We're completely bent on ourselves, and we want the best only for us. But God has better things in store for creation than we could ever hope and dream of. And so there's a couple of things here. One, I asked you, what is the best case scenario for you? Like, what is a perfect life for you, a good life for you? And I wanted you to think about that. And for me, it was probably finishing college and starting a business and amassing some wealth, and then hopefully maybe leaving it to my children. But the reality is, that is such a dead-end street, because maybe my children get my wealth. Maybe I pass a business down to them, but my great-great-grandchildren probably won't even know my name. And so it's utterly meaningless. And I want to share with you that part of the reason that I follow Jesus is because he's freed me from so many elements of sin, so many, ways that sin plays out. And one of the things is this pointless life where I would pursue these things that are utterly meaningless. But he has reoriented me, and now instead of following myself and what I want for me, Jesus has called me into something greater. So Jesus rescued me and saved me from sin and the effects of me just pursuing what I think is a good life, but then waking up probably when I was like 50 years old and realizing this doesn't mean a whole lot. So another element of sin that Jesus just completely crushes and demolishes is the fact that sin, on a very basic level, disqualifies me, if I have sin in my life, from being in the presence of God. So it disqualifies me from being in the promised land, this place where God is present and reigns and things are as they should be. I think that's a good definition of heaven even. So basically, sin disqualifies me from being in the presence of God. And Jesus defeated sin by taking on the punishment for my sin himself. So God saves me not only from myself and a definition of life success that is ultimately pointless, but also he saves me from the ultimate effects of sin, which is that sin disqualifies me from being in the presence of God. And so we see this play out in the story, and this is the gospel. So just like these people, we talked about Leviticus 18. If they are not faithful, then they are going to be spewed out from the land. Well, this is a major spoiler alert. These people are going to be spewed out from the land. They're not going to be faithful to the covenant. They're going to be exiled. And if we're like, come on, man, like how can y'all keep messing it up? Well, the reality is you would mess it up too. I would mess it up too. And that's the Christian gospel. That we do not deserve to be in the promised land, that we are disqualified from the promised land because of our sinful hearts, our selfishness. But just like them, they benefited and gained a promise that they did not deserve. And the same is true for us. That's the gospel. We do not deserve to be in the presence of God, but we get to be anyway because of the goodness of Jesus. So I joked about, having a business and that being pointless. In no way do I want to say that owning a business or doing anything besides full-time ministry is pointless. I mean just the opposite. We need more people who understand the goodness of Jesus, what they've been saved from and what they've been saved to do, to be out in the world. And so I think that if you fully understand this, that people aren't going to probably watch a video like this. Not many people are going to do that, so we need more people out in the world proclaiming the gospel, sharing these things that they have been saved from and saved to. The main point is, are you following Jesus? Is Jesus your leader? Are you looking to yourself, and this sounds weird to say, to lead yourself? Because we've seen that humans, we always choose ourselves and we go down these dead-end roads. Is Jesus your leader? Have you allowed Jesus to lead you in all aspects of your life? Or are you determining the best course for your life? And so for those of you who are not Christians, maybe you're in the group, you're exploring this sort of thing, I would ask you, what are you being led towards? What is your definition of a good life and success, and how do you define that? Maybe share that with your group. I would beg you, though, if your reason for not following Jesus is Christians, and because they're hypocritical, I would just ask you to look at the Bible and to acknowledge that even the Bible itself says that humans are messed up, sinful people that don't represent God well all the time. And so don't let that keep you from seeing the goodness of God just because people are messed up. And also, I would encourage you, if maybe some of these Old Testament stories seem strange to you, to fast forward to the resurrection of Jesus, because if he wasn't resurrected, then none of this matters. We talked about God keeping his promises. Well, I think the ultimate form of God keeping his promises was resurrecting Jesus. If this has changed your life and you realize that you have been setting the course for your life and not following Jesus and letting him set the course for your life, I would encourage you to reflect back on the part of the story where the people passed through the Jordan River. That's a significant biblical image, and it relates to baptism, of going from desert to new life. It's a major transition, and even in this story, it's a commemorative experience. And I would encourage you to check that out, to talk with your small group about that, because essentially it is a New Testament image of baptism as well, is to die to yourself and be raised to a new life. So you participate in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And so you die to your own desires and are raised to a new life, following Jesus and being obedient to him, being freed from sin and slavery and raised to freedom in Christ. And so if you're considering this, I would ask your small group leaders or someone in your small group and just have a discussion with them.